Hello history lovers and welcome back to the channel. Catherine Howard was stripped of her title as Queen of England on the 22nd of November 1541. Catherine's uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, searched the Lambeth home of his stepmother, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, which is where Catherine spent much of her childhood and liaisons with Dereham. Agnes removed all of Dereham's papers to try and protect herself from being accused of neglect, which, unsurprisingly, made her look quite guilty. Realising how bad it looked burning the papers, Agnes feigned illness. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough to stop Sir Thomas Wriothesley, the Earl of Southampton, to arrest and take her to the Tower of London. Agnes was interrogated by Lord Chancellor Audley, where she gave enough information to incriminate the whole Howard family. She was interrogated again at the end of November. Wriothesley visited Agnes while she was in the Tower, and this time she was actually ill. He assured her on His Majesty's behalf of her own life if she would in some sort make us her ghostly confessors. Agnes begged for the king's forgiveness for not informing the king prior to his marriage to Catherine, and confessed that she did know of the affection between Dereham and Catherine, but didn't think it was that deep. The lords told Henry that she appeared wondrous, sorrowful, repentant, and sickly. Henry Manox was fortunate and escaped punishment, but Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham were tried together by the Privy Council on the 1st of December 1541. Dereham was accused of presumptive treason, which accused both the Queen and her accomplices of having led an abominable, base, carnal, voluptuous and licentious life. Catherine, who was not being tried, was described as a common harlot. In her book The Six Wives of King Henry VIII, Alison Weir delves further into the accusations against Dereham. Quote, Dereham was accused of joining the Queen's service with ill intent, traitorously imagining that he and she might continue their wicked behaviour. He was further accused of having concealed the pre-contract between them to facilitate Catherine's marriage to the king. Her acquiescence to this was taken as proof of her intention to continue in her abominable life. Of course, Dereham pleaded not guilty to all of these accusations, although there was little he could say in his defence. Culpeper, on the other hand, was charged with having had criminal intercourse with the Queen in August 1541 at Pontefract, and at other times before and after this date. Catherine was accused of having suggested that she loved him above the king and all the others, and Culpeper was accused of encouraging Catherine to commit adultery. Culpeper initially pleaded not guilty, but realising the uphill battle he was facing, changed his plea to guilty during the trial. Both men were, unsurprisingly, found guilty, and they were both sentenced by the Duke of Norfolk to be drawn on hurdles to Tyburn, and there hanged, cut down alive, disemboweled, and, they still living, their bowels burnt, the bodies then to be beheaded and quartered. French Ambassador Charles de Marillac wrote to King Francis I, saying that he felt Culpeper deserved to die, but for Catherine, he predicted that the end of these tragedies will be no less scandalous than pitiful. It did not look like the king was going to be as merciful as he had once promised to be. His love for Catherine had become hatred. And what's worse, it wasn't just his heart that was wounded, it was his pride. A wounded pride that made him look and feel like a fool. On one occasion, he had called for a sword to slay her he had loved so much. Sitting in council, he suddenly called for horses without saying where he would go. Sometimes he will say irrelevantly that the wicked woman had never such delight in her incontinence as she should have torture in her death. Marillac recorded that a few days later the king indulged in his favourite pastimes of music and hunting, and yet despite all this, he had never looked so miserable. In early December, the Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapuis, who had been at court since Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, noted that Henry had shown more sorrow at Catherine's misdemeanours than he had at the treason of Anne Boleyn, the loss of Jane Seymour, or the divorce of his first wife and love, Katherine of Aragon. Anne of Cleves doesn't really need to be mentioned here, as there wasn't any love involved at all. As Chapuis puts it, it is like the case of the woman who cried most bitterly at the loss of her 10th husband, than at the death of all the others together. Though he had been a good man, it was because she had never buried one of them before without being sure of the next, and as yet this king has formed neither a plan nor a preference. Dereham was tortured on the 6th of December 1541. He was asked about how he had treasonously predicted the king's death, and how he would marry Katherine if the king were dead. Dereham denied such a claim until he was informed that his friend William Damport, who had been tortured prior, had confessed such information, at which Dereham could not deny. In his written confession, Dereham admitted that they had exchanged a promise of marriage, and that they had lived together as husband and wife while in the service of Agnes, and that to many they were betrothed. What he did not confess to was committing adultery with Katherine. Henry read Dereham's confession later that day, and he was furious that Dereham had not confessed to adultery with Katherine, declaring that he thought Dereham hath deserved no such mercy at his hand, and therefore hath determined that he shall suffer the whole execution. Dereham and Culpeper were both executed on the 10th of December 1541. Culpeper was first, as he was of noble birth. He was allowed the more merciful death of beheading rather than his original sentence of hanged, drawn, and quartering. But no block was provided. Culpeper knelt, and with one stroke of the axe his head was severed from his body. Dereham, on the other hand, was not so lucky. He suffered the horror of being hanged, disemboweled, beheaded, and then quartered. Both men's heads were put on pikes above London Bridge, a horrific sight that Katherine would later be forced to witness. Agnes Tilney would be questioned again later that day, and she admitted to having pushed Katherine under Henry's nose to improve her family standings, and she also confessed to destroying Dereham's letters. In mid-December 1541, other members of the Howard family were arrested. Lord William Howard, his wife, and Anne Howard, the Dowager Duchess's daughter, were imprisoned in the Tower. Despite having had little involvement with Catherine Howard and vehemently protesting his innocence, Lord William was arrested. His arrest was particularly unjustified, as he had been serving as the governor of Calais for the past year, and could not have been complicit in Catherine's adultery. Additionally, Lord William's sister, another Catherine Howard, the Countess of Bridgewater, was also incarcerated in the Tower. Her children, along with Lord William's, were placed in the care of Archbishop Cranmer and others. On the 14th of December 1541, Uncle Norfolk, having heard of the arrests of the other members of his family, wrote a letter to the king, in which he basically excused himself from all guilt and once again abandoned his family.
Real original.
He assured the king that he thought the arrests were justified after the abominable deeds done by my two nieces. I fear your majesty will abhor to hear speak of me or my kin again. Prostrate at your majesty's feet, I remind your majesty that much of this has come to light through my own report of my mother-in-law's words to me when I was sent to Lambeth to search Dereham's coffers. My own truth, and the small love my mother-in-law and my two false traitorous nieces bear me, make me hope, and I pray your majesty for some comfortable assurance of your royal favour, without which I will never desire to live. If Norfolk was looking for reassurance from the king, then he was to be bitterly disappointed, as no reassurance came. Henry was upset with all of the Howards. After all, they had brought Catherine to his attention in the first place. Days later, on the 22nd, the rest of the Howard family and their servants were arraigned for misprision of treason, for concealing the evil demeanour of the Queen, to the slander of the King and his succession. Notable names included Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Catherine Tilney, Elizabeth Tilney, Joan Bulmer, and William Damport. They all pleaded guilty and were imprisoned, but not long afterwards the king pardoned most of them and had them freed. The Dowager Duchess, who was also included in the indictment, was not brought to trial, as she was regarded as too old and may die out of perversity to defraud the King's Highness of the confiscation of her goods. But she was sentenced to loss of freedom and had her lands confiscated. I think the best reaction to all of this has to come from King Francis I, who exclaimed, "She hath done wondrous naughty." Francis then wrote to Henry, "I am sorry to hear of the displeasure and trouble which has been caused by the lewd and naughty behaviour of the Queen, albeit, knowing my good brother to be a prince of prudence, virtue, and honour, I do require him to shift off the said displeasure, and wisely, temperately, like myself, not reputing his honour to rest in the lightness of a woman, but to thank God of all, comforting himself in God's goodness. The lightness of women cannot bend the honour of men." Christmas that year must have been a sad affair for the king, and at the end of January the next year, an act of attainder against Katherine was approved. It wasn't looking good for Katherine. If Dereham and Culpeper had been found guilty, which they had, then there was no hope for her. On the 25th of January, it seems that Henry was concerned that Katherine had not yet had chance to defend herself in public, and so he sent some members of the council to see her, and they invited her to come to Parliament so she could defend herself. Katherine declined the king's offer, saying that she submitted herself to the king's mercy. Her humility softens the hearts of the privy councillors. I do wonder as well whether she thought there was any point. I hate to draw parallels between her and her cousin Anne Boleyn. Actually, that's a lie. I love to draw parallels between those two. But Anne had the opportunity to defend herself, and actually, by all accounts, she did extremely well. And yet, it made no difference. The council did give her another chance to clear her name, but yet again she declined, possibly because she also knew that she didn't have a good enough defence. She claims that she only cared about making a good death, and to leave a good opinion in people's minds now at parting. On the 29th of January 1542, the Imperial Ambassador Eustace Shaftesbury reported that Katherine was very cheerful and more plump and pretty than ever. She is as careful about her dress and as imperious and wilful as at the time she was with the king. Notwithstanding that she expects to be put to death, that she confesses she has deserved it, and asks for no favour except that the execution shall be secret and not under the eyes of the world. Katherine would not get her wish. Shaftesbury also reported to Charles V that Henry had never been so merry since first hearing of the Queen's misconduct. On that same day, Henry held a banquet. In attendance were 61 ladies and the estranged wife of the poet Thomas Wyatt, who the king showed particular interest in. It was also noted that the king showed interest in another young lady, Anne Bassett, for whom Alison Weir suggests that the king had always had a soft spot for. Shaftesbury, who reported this event, noted that rumour had it that this king will not be long without a wife, because of the great desire he has to have further issue. And that's where I'm going to leave today's episode. If you liked today's video, then why not support the channel by leaving a like or subscribe, or even share this video with a friend. And if you really like this video, then why not leave a super thanks. That's it from me, but as always, have a wonderful day.